There's been controversy in the news this week as visiting Polish climber Filip Babicz has claimed the second ascent of the hardest route in Scotland, Greg Boswell's Bring de Ruckus, at 12:13. However, the internet has been ablaze because due to the conditions and style in which the route was climbed, there's been questions as to whether or not it is indeed a valid ascent. But there's a lot to unpack from that, and within this report we'll be going into more detail on what it means for a route to be in Scottish winter condition, and the tradition and ethics behind that highly specialised discipline. However, before we begin, we want to make this clear that this is not a witch hunt, but what it is an awkward conversation about style and ethics, and within this report we hope to get both sides of the story. First and foremost though, what are Scottish winter conditions? And to give the exact definition, we'll refer to the SMC's Scottish Winter Climbs Guidebook, which says, Scottish winter climbing is not defined by calendar but by style. The crag must look wintry for a route to qualify as a winter ascent. For ice routes, the presence of ice is enough, but for rocky mixed routes, this means having hoar, rime or snow on the rock. It's this last bit that's most appropriate for Bring de Ruckus because that is indeed a mixed route. And mixed routes, generally speaking, have to be white in appearance in order to be seen as a valid Scottish winter ascent. This is also part of where Scottish winter climbing is at its most quirky, because were you to climb in Europe or North America and for it to be that white, it'd generally be considered to be out of condition, because actually the hoar and rime that form on the rock make it really bloody awkward to climb. But that's part of the Scottish winter magic. Because the mountains of Scotland aren't on an Alpine or North American scale, they're relatively small in the grand scheme of things. The action has to be really packed within. And so these conditions become a central part of that Scottish winter day out, where you're being blasted around by the conditions, and as much clear your way up a climb as you are actually climbing a climb, because it adds to the challenge significantly when, say, a foothold or a torque is hidden somewhere underneath rime. And so when a route is clear of hoar or rime or snow and the cliff is black, it's not said to be in Scottish winter condition. Now obviously it's not that simple or that binary. It's not a 0 and a 1, black or white, and there's many shades in between. In the case of Greg's ascent of Bring de Ruckus, the majority of the route was indeed white, the only exception to that being just underneath the area of the roof, where the crux of the route was. Now this sort of steep terrain doesn't rime or hoar up readily because of the fact that the wind doesn't blast the snow into its surface. As a result, it's much more prone to being black. Now this wasn't a problem in yesteryear because of the fact that Scottish winter climbing never went into that sort of terrain. It's only as the grading has got higher and the routes have got harder that they've ventured into this sort of steep and uncharted territory. But the roof aside, the route was very much considered in condition, and the style in which Greg approached the route, which was originally on site and then ground up after he'd taken a fall from the roof, was very much within the values of Scottish winter ethic. The difference with Filip's ascent is that the rock was very much black, as you can see from the pictures. Now this isn't to say that he didn't climb it in winter condition, because it was obviously winter. You can see from the photos there's snow around, and Filip himself reported icicles hanging from the roof. This was not a route without challenge, and the corrie that day was undoubtedly wintry. But the route didn't necessarily fit within the stipulations of what Scottish winter conditions are, meaning that the rock wasn't white. Now in terms of approach, Filip originally tried the route ground up before failing in and around the roof, and then opted to inspect the route via abseil. He then led the route afterwards, placing all gear on lead. So it was a head point in terms of its style, which again goes against the grain of what Scottish winter ethic is. So head pointing in Scottish winter is unusual, not least due to the fact that it's just really difficult to set up top ropes throughout the vast majority of Scottish winter cliffs, be that to do with anchors at the top, or in the case of bigger cliffs, simply being that no one would want to abseil down and inspect a route that's going to be hundreds and hundreds of meters long. The most recent example of this was Tim Miller and Jamie Skeldon's ascent of Stone Bastion in winter on Shelterstone in the northern Cairngorms. They'd originally climbed the route ground up over multiple seasons before getting stuck at the bastion up high. Eventually they decided to abseil the route and give it pre-practice, and when they'd finally successfully done that, They started from the bottom, again, climbing the route in a single push to the top. Now this style did attract some criticism from Scottish winter stalwarts, but they were honest and open about their style, and the route was very much in condition. It was white. Thus it was deemed to be a valid ascent, and after all, style is always there to be improved on. And a good example of this is the route Happy Tyroleans that was originally put up by visiting Austrians at the 2001 Winter International Meet. The route was climbed in a red point style, and it became a major project for the likes of Dave McLeod, who initially tried to on-site it before failing and then eventually climbing it ground up over a period of multiple years. And eventually it was on-sited by Greg Boswell, which seemed like a major achievement, and that the story of this route had finally come full circle. So to bring this back to Filip, we interviewed Filip on site, and one thing was really clear. He actually cares a lot about the traditions, and that is what brought him to Scotland in the first place. Filip had an interesting observation from an outsider looking in about the winter climbing ethic in Scotland. I agree that the mountains with relatively low-lying altitudes, like in Scotland, extra rules outside the simple calendar window are necessary so that the winter climbing game makes sense. However, the ethics were created long before desperate overhangs and roofs were tackled and high-end routes were established. And Filip, of course, is right. He uses Dave McLeod's example of Anubis, his grade 12, the first grade 12 within Scotland. Anubis blew all of the boundaries at the time, taking in terrain that no other Scottish winter route had before it. It overhung 10 metres when it's 35-metre length. And it's very difficult to compare a route like that with maybe your Scottish winter 4 or 5, which lies at the significantly slabbier end of the spectrum. And I guess the question that Dave raised at the time and Filip's raising now is ultimately, what do you do with the standards when they keep getting pushed? Because as the routes get steeper and steeper, the less and less likely they are to be white. But the issue is that these are, at least currently, the parameters that are in place. They are the guidelines. And not only that, but they're the ones that Greg stuck to on the first ascent. And that's not just in terms of the conditions, but also in terms of the style of that ground up approach. Now this isn't to say that Greg himself hasn't abseil inspected routes before. His own first ascent of Banana Wall, his grade 12 in Corrian Lochan in the northern corries of Cairngorm, he abseil inspected that route as best he could, albeit because of its steep nature, he couldn't inspect it as much as he might have liked. At the time, Greg said within an interview for the BMC, "I suppose the progression of Scottish winter climbing depends on people pushing themselves in their own way. And if people want to try routes after rappel inspection or after trying moves on a top rope, then that's up to them. As long as they eventually get up the route and keep pushing their own limits, then hopefully the sport will keep progressing and moving in the right direction." So where does this leave us? I think Filip's left in a really awkward position, because from the outside perspective, as someone coming into Scottish winter climbing, there are a lot of inconsistencies. Routes aren't just black and white. And he obviously had ice on the route in places, but not the mandatory snow that was required. So as a result, his ascent is deemed as being out of condition, despite being, from at least a European standing, in condition. Perhaps with the absence of snow, would it be better being graded with an M grade as opposed to that Scottish winter grade? And does this make it its second ascent or not? Is it seen as being valid? Now, Filip's undoubtedly climbed something. He has made an ascent. But given the fact that it's so different from what is at the core of the Scottish winter ethic, is it the second ascent? I'm not so sure. But it's obvious that it's been deep and meaningful an experience for him, and I don't want this to come across as a slight on that. The only way I can think of analysing it is were I to go to, say, somewhere like the Czech Republic, where there's a strict ethic of climbing without chalk and without camming devices or metal climbing protection, and then going there and climbing with said equipment. It would go against the grain, and as a result, I in turn would expect some degree of pushback. In an attempt to answer some of these questions, UKC will be interviewing key protagonists from the Scottish winter scene to get an idea of where they see the future lying, particularly for steeper routes and harder routes on terrain that's less likely to become snowed up and white. It is a really blurry and awkward set of lines and not an exact science. And if you've got any thoughts, please leave a comment below.